So I want to talk to you tonight. I want to go over, first of all, very simply, what is negative gearing. This is a picture of someone's butt, and that's their back pocket. So negative gearing is any investment property that you purchase that during the course of a month or a year is taking money out of your back pocket. Does that make sense? So a negatively geared property is a property that costs you money. So all of the rent that you get for the property is less than all of the expenses associated with the property. Therefore, there's less money in your hip pocket. Does that make sense? So then how would we define a positively geared property? What would that be?
Money in your pocket.
A positively geared property is just exactly the opposite. A positively geared property is putting money into your pocket. So, like I said here, the rent is less than the property expenses for negative gearing. Positively gearing, the rent is greater than the property expenses. Now, there's some tax implications for both of those two scenarios. A negatively geared property, if you're losing money on it, the ATO will give you a tax break. And you are able to offset any other income that you make against any losses that you make on your rental property, so you get a benefit. You pay less tax, meaning more money again in your pocket at the end of the year. Now, but the opposite is said for positively geared property. Now, I own both positive and negatively geared properties. Positively geared properties that I own give me money each month and each year, which is good, but then I have to pay more tax on them, which is bad. But then I also own negatively geared properties, which I lose money on each year and each month, but I get a tax break. So there's both pros and cons. And so we're not particularly here today to promote one kind of investment or another. I've been to seminars before called positively geared property, and they basically said negative gearing is bad and positively geared property is good. And I can understand that way of thinking, but that's not particularly what we're here to do tonight. We just want to share with you the pros and cons, the negatives and the positives of each, so that you can make an informed decision and work out what's going to be best for you. Does that make sense? All right. Well, we're going to keep going through. Now, one of the important things to realise, and it illustrates it quite well up on this little diagram here, is that over time, a negatively geared property can become a positively geared property. How does that happen? Does anyone want to venture a guess as to how that happens? How does a negatively geared property become a positively geared property? Call it out to me. That's right. If your rent increases over time, which normally it does, although over the last sort of 12 months it's actually gone the other way, but normally, most years, as time goes by, rent's increased. The first investment property I got, I was renting the house out for something like $220 a week. And then over time, I was eventually renting it out for $550 a week. And now it's dropped down to about $450 a week. So, but over time, a negatively geared property can become a positively geared property if you hold it for long enough. It probably won't happen straight away, but it probably will happen if you hold it for an extended period, something like 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 or 50 years. Now, some of us in the room don't have the luxury of being able to hold a property for that long, but I reckon you, as a 17-year-old investor, may well be able to own a property for 50 years. So if you imagine what was your name again? Carl. Imagine if Carl buys his first investment property as a young fella. Let's say he's 20 when he buys his first one. And the rent, and he holds it for a long, long, long time. Let's say he holds it till he's 60. What's going to happen to rents over the next 40 years? They're going to increase and increase and increase over time. Because if you look back, how much were things... I don't know what rents were in Perth 40 years ago, but what do you reckon rents would have been in Perth 40 years ago? Oh, maybe... even $100 a week, maybe? Back in the 1975? Yeah, I reckon you might have got a rental for about $40 or $50 a week. Yeah. So over time, rents increase, as do property prices, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later. So what I want to do is talk to you about the pros and cons of negative gearing. I'm going to hand my clicker over to you now, Travis, only because I've only got two hands and I need one for the microphone, one for the pen, and I don't have a spare one for the clicker. So the first positive of negative gearing is this. You get a tax deduction. And I've run out of space, so I've just written tax deduct, but you've all got notepads, so you can write the full thing. The reason, and one of the main reasons why negative gearing is good, is we get a tax deduction. The ATO gives us a break. So if we lose money on that property, we get some money back at the end of the year, assuming we paid tax that year. If you didn't pay any tax for whatever reason, because maybe you were retired or you weren't working or whatever, or you had loads of other deductions, you won't get the benefit from that. But if you paid tax, you can claim a loss of that money that you lost on your rental property, and that's why negative gearing works. Does that make sense? All right, next one. Pro number 2. Now, most properties in Australia are negatively geared. And I've heard that, I don't actually know if it's true or not, but it was on the internet or I watched it on YouTube or something. Someone said that 93% of investment properties in Australia are negatively geared. And that sounds about right to me, because I know it's pretty hard to find a positively geared property. Most properties that you go, if you went out and looked at a property and you just picked one, most likely it's going to be negatively geared. What that means is you buy that property and the costs associated with you owning that property are going to be greater than the income that you're going to get from it. Does that sound about right? So most properties that you buy are going to be negatively geared. So you've actually got lots of options with negatively geared properties. You can buy apartment somewhere, you can buy a house on the coast, you can buy somewhere in Perth, you can buy somewhere in Geraldton, you can buy somewhere in Sydney. You've got lots of options. So most properties that you buy, most properties that you go and look at are negatively geared. So if you kind of fall in love with any particular property, the chances are it's going to be negatively geared. Does that make it a good investment? Well, we don't know. You're going to have to do your research, but there's other factors. But one of the positives, one of the benefits of negative gearing is that most properties are negatively geared, so you've got a smorgasbord of choice available. Next one, Travis. Where's Sandy? Is that how you spell depreciation? I always really struggle with spelling depreciation. And on my PowerPoint, it doesn't always pick up my spell check. So that's how you spell it? Depreciation. So I'm just going to write DEPRO, because I won't fit the whole on it. But you can all on your notes write depreciation. Now what that means, depreciation means that if you buy a property, and Paul mentioned it before, if you buy one of their apartments for the next 40 years, you can depreciate 2.5%. Is that right, Sandy? I don't want to say anything that I'm not meant to say because I'm not an accountant. But over the next 40 years, you can depreciate 2.5% of the value of the purchase price of that property and write that off on your tax. So if you buy a property for $1 million, what tax deduction does that mean you get each year? $25,000. It's quite a lot. What?
Sorry, that would include the plant and equipment.
That would include your, yeah, okay, you're right. So it's not the 2.5, yeah. So plant equipment, and you have to do the different percentages. But you've got a big deduction anyway. Good, that's why you're here. Talk to Sandy about your depreciation. So when you buy an investment property, you can depreciate the value of that property down, which gives you an extra deduction. That means if you're paying tax, you're getting some money back at the end of each tax year. Does that sound good? That's one of the reasons, probably one of the main reasons why we do negative gearing. Next slide, Travis. So the other reason why negative gearing is good, one of the positives of negative gearing is that you have other opportunities. Now one of the things, I'm just going to write that, opportunity. Is that how you spell it? No. So opportunity. One of the things I like to do is I buy these beat up old houses on these great big blocks and then I develop them. And you make a lot of money doing that. It's great. But when you own those properties, you hardly can rent them out for anything because the houses are so rubbish. And they're a pain because you get rubbishy tenants because the houses are falling apart. But I like to do it occasionally, every now and again. But one of the things about those kind of properties is they're negatively geared because you can't, all the value's in the land and the house is rubbish, so you can't rent it out for very much. So, but it's an opportunity. So negative gearing, you do it because it gives you other opportunities. Another reason why you might choose to buy a negatively geared property is it's falling apart a bit, but you're a bit of a handyman and you can fix it up and spruce it up and add value, add some capital growth to the property because you think you can make some extra money that way. Still negatively geared because you bought a beat up old place and that maybe the depreciation's not that good on it, but there are other reasons why we can buy a negatively geared property. Next slide, Travis. Now, one of the next things I want to talk about is negatively geared properties are considered a very safe and stable option, investment option. So if you compare it to shares, you compare it to other kinds of investment vehicles, a negatively geared property, if you just go and buy a little house in the suburbs somewhere, it's not going to double in value overnight, but it's a safe and stable and secure option. You should be able to find a tenant for it. You should be able to get a regular income. You should be able to easily predict what your rental income is going to be on that property. It's not going to, half in value overnight. It's not going to double in value overnight, but it's a nice, safe and secure, stable investment option. Does that make sense? Next pro. The biggest benefit is to high income earners. So if you're on max tax bracket, if you're paying a lot of tax, maybe you're a FIFO worker or a doctor or a lawyer or whatever, you've got lots of income coming in, you will get the best benefit out of having a negatively geared property because your deductions will be better because you're paying a higher tax rate, so you're actually getting more money back in your pocket. I'll go to the next one, Trav. Now this is the only reason, I want to stress this, I'm going to stand up here so I can stress this. The only reason why we buy negatively geared property is because of the expected capital growth. There's no other reason. You don't buy a negatively geared property because you want a tax deduction. Does that make sense? Yeah. I've heard loads of people try and explain to me that you want to buy a negatively geared property because you want a tax deduction. Is getting a good tax deduction a good enough reason to buy a negatively geared property, Sandy? No. Why would you want to lose money? You don't want to lose money so that you can pay less tax. You're sticking it to the government, maybe, but you're actually worse off. The only reason that you want to buy a negatively geared property is because you're expecting it to increase in value. And you're actually expecting it to increase in value much more than the loss that you're losing each year. And it might be something like, you're losing $1,000 every year and you're getting a bit of a tax deduction on that, but you're hoping to make, $50,000 every year, something like that in the capital growth. Now, over the last bunch of years, there hasn't been big growth in Perth. So it kind of hasn't really been working that well. But like what we were talking about before, we think there's a property cycle. It has been flat, has been stagnant. We think we're coming out of that now. We think we're going to be moving into the growth years. That's where you get the real benefit out of owning a negatively geared property. Does that make sense? All right, next one. So if you look here, this is the Perth market over the last 40 years. So 1974, you can see the value of property, it was down at about sort of something like $20,000. Over the years, it's increased and increased and increased. Now, you'll notice this graph finishes at 2013. Essentially, since then, it's been fairly flat, although we have had a little bit of an increase. I'll flick over to the next slide, Trav. So that shows the market that goes from 2011 to 2015. The blue line is the house value. So you'll see there's a little bit of extra increase, although it has been largely fairly flat. Can you flick back to the real one? This is the reason why we do negative gearing, guys. You want to buy a property, and like what we were talking about before, you want to hold it for 10 and 20 and 50 or however long. As long as you can hold the property, it's good to hold on to it. Should increase in value over time. If you have to sell it quick, if you have to buy it and then sell it 2 or 3 years later, you may not make any money. But if you can hold it over time, If you can get through a couple of those property cycles, a couple of stagnant flat years and then a couple of kind of boom years, and then you kind of hold it through a few of those boom years, that's where you make your money in property. So the most important indicator of whether you're going to succeed in your property investment is, are you willing to stick it out and hold it over the long term? So I'll flick through, Trav. So this is going back to 1926. So this is through the whole of Australia. This is not just Perth. So if someone invested in property, Australian residential property, back in 1926 and held it, you buy it for $100, something that you bought for $100 back in 1926, 90 years later, in 2016, it's going to be worth on average 1.6 million, 1.638 million, which over the if you work out the percentage over the years, that's an average return of 11%, which is very similar to the growth that we've also seen in shares. We'll go to the next slide, Trevor.
That's your brother-in-law there.
Was it? At least you didn't fall asleep, mate. All right, so I'm going to go to the negatives of negative gearing. So there are positives and there are negatives. I want to talk to you about some of the negatives of negative gearing. Number one, this is the worst negative of negative gearing, I reckon. Negative gearing drains your cash flow. Like the person with the pocket at the start, there's money coming out of your pocket each week and each month and each year, so that you're actually losing money. Now, if you're a very high income earner, you can afford to have a negatively geared property. If you're a low income earner, if you're a retired person and you're losing money each week, each month, each year, is that going to work? Probably not as well. So you really have to watch that. I'm going to move on to the next slide, because this is the second negative of negative gearing. There is a risk there. If you hold too many negatively geared properties, if you have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 negatively geared properties and you don't have enough income, you have a risk of going bankrupt. That means you can't afford to pay all your expenses. You can't afford to pay the bank back. The bank comes in and says, thank you very much, we'll take all your properties, and they say, see you later. Now, if you've got a whole bunch of positively geared properties and each month you're getting money put into your back pocket, that risk is less. You've still got to manage your finances appropriately. But if you're holding too many negatively geared properties and then let's say you lose your job or something, you could be in big trouble, particularly if you can't sell the properties because the market's changed and they're worth less than what you bought them for. But if you're holding positively geared properties and you're looking after your properties well and you've got a good property manager, and you're able to rent them out, the risks there are a lot less. Go to the next slide, Trev. Capital gains tax. So I'm saying this is a negative of negative gearing. If you make a great big profit from holding property and then you sell it, do you know what the government does? They take a whole bunch of money. It feels like a real negative to me. Is it a negative, paying tax, Sandy? Isn't it? Yeah, I thought you'd say that. So I should be happy when I make a big profit and then I have to give a bunch of it to the government. No, I'm still going to put it as a negative. I know I should be happy that I made a big profit. I know I should be feeling good about myself that I've made a ton of money on this investment, but when you have to pay a great big chunk of money to the government one end of financial year, because you made a big profit, it does feel like a bit of a negative. I'm not saying it is negative because we should be happy, but it's something that you've got to think about. And one of the issues with negative gearing that you have to factor in and talk to your accountant about is capital gains tax. Because it can...
You can minimise it in something.
There's several ways to minimise it, and I won't even venture to be brave enough to talk about those because I'll say go and talk to Sandy about ways you can minimise your capital gains tax. Absolutely. All right, we'll go to the next one, Trav. Now, did you know that it is possible when you invest in property to lose money?
Absolutely.
It is possible. Now, we don't do it because of that. We think, when I invest in property, I always just assume they're going to go up in value, but it is possible to lose money investing in property. And I've lost tons of money on some of my properties. I've made millions on many properties and I've lost hundreds of thousands on others. So you've got to You've got to understand, if you buy a property, there is a chance that it will decrease in value, depending on the market and depending on how you look after it and a range of other things. But there is a chance. So you need to be careful, and you need to get some people around you that will help you make the smartest and best possible decision so as to maximise your chance of getting good capital growth on your property. Does that make sense? All right, next one. Now, Phil, I'm going to talk to him. Did you know that you can reduce, if you have too many negative properties, negatively geared properties, and then you're spending all this money out of your back pocket, and then you go to someone like Phil from Aussie, and you want to buy another investment property, do you know what he might do? He might tell you can't buy another one because of this word called serviceability. What does serviceability mean, Phil?
Your ability to repay a loan. Basically, will you get approved or not?
That's right. Serviceability. Can you afford to pay your loan repayments? And if you've got too many negatively geared properties, you can't afford it.
Actually, some lenders it helps you. So,
Okay.
because it reduces your tax,
Okay,
they
yep.
allow for more. Yeah, so some. Not
Some. But as a general rule, if you're paying money out, your serviceability goes down. Next slide. So this is another negative of negative gearing. If you're a low income earner and you're not paying any tax anyway, you don't get any benefit out of having a negatively geared property. So this poor guy, he probably doesn't know very much. If he went and bought an investment property and negatively geared it, he wouldn't get any benefit because he's not paying any tax. Right, next one. All right, so we're going to move on to the positives of positive gearing. So number one, the first positive of positive gearing is this. Cash flow. Cash flow is what? Cash flow is king. If you have a positively geared property, of which I own a couple, do you know what happens at the end of each month? Your property manager sends you this statement, and this money just appears in your bank account, and if it's positively geared, all your expenses that you've had to pay, you know, your bank interest, which is normally your biggest one, is like this amount, but the rental amount that you got is bigger than all of your other expenses. And at the end of each year, you have to give this thing to the tax department. It's basically a summary of all your properties, and you add up all your expenses, and you add up all your income, all your rent that you got from different properties. And did you know that you can have the income from your properties being bigger than all of your expenses? And that's a good feeling. And sometimes it can be quite a lot bigger. It means the person, your tenant, is giving you this money, and the ATO is giving you some tax breaks and all this, and you can actually make money from holding and owning a property. And that's what positively geared property is all about. And that's the biggest positive about positive gearing. You can make money from it. We'll go to the next slide. Now the next thing is, with all that extra money that you've got some options. You can go and spend that money on whatever you want. You can go on holidays. You can buy, I thought you said you bought a suit, but it was a $35,000 holiday and a fancy suit to go with it. You've got options. You can buy other investment properties. You can do what I often do and go and invest in shares and lose it all. You can do whatever you want. You can buy chocolates, you can buy wine, you can do whatever. You can give it to other people, all sorts of things. But when you're making extra money, you've got extra options. And that's why we invest in property. That's one of the positives of positively geared property. Let's go to the next slide, Trav. Depreciation. Again, I'll let you read the funny. I thought that was quite funny, how much I depreciate. Same as negative gearing. If you buy a property that's positively geared, and I've got properties like this, you're making money off them, but you can claim all this depreciation. You can depreciate the bricks and mortar, you can depreciate the plant and equipment, you get a depreciation schedule done by a quantity surveyor, and and you give it to your accountant, and you get this extra money back from your tax. That's what depreciation is. So even on a positively geared, you can make a property that you're making money on you can get enough depreciation on it so you don't have to pay any tax anyway, depending on how the numbers pan out. So depreciation can be your friend again in positively geared property. Let's go to the next one, Trap. Serviceability. Now, one of the positives with positively geared property, if you're getting all this extra money in from rent, when you go and talk to Phil at Aussie, he'll save you. I know you love that joke. So because you're getting the extra income, they will take that into account to determine your serviceability for when you can, how much you can borrow for your next property. Now, they'll normally only take 80% of your rental, is that right? That's what Phil and other mortgage brokers always tell me. You can only take into account some of your income, but if you're positively geared, if your rent is higher, you're more likely to be able to then go and buy your next property, which is good. So the next positive, Trap, is you can offset. Everyone write down offset, those people taking notes. You can offset positive cash flow against other negatively geared properties. So if you own a couple of positively geared properties and a couple of negatively geared properties and you're making money on your positive ones, you can offset that income with other properties that you've got where you're losing money. So that's a benefit. We'll go to the next one. Now this is one a lot of people don't realise. Did you know that almost any property can be positively geared? I know I said before that only something like 7% of properties that are purchased are positively geared. How can you make almost any property positively geared? That's right. The clue's up on the screen. You put enough deposit, that's right. Good job to the people that got that right. You can make any property, just about any property that's generating income positively geared. If you pay enough deposit, you can make it positively geared. So even if your rent is, even if normally it would be negatively geared, if you had to borrow 100% of the purchase price, if you pay maybe 50% of the purchase price in cash, that property then becomes positively geared because your loan expenses and your loan repayments are less. Does that make sense? So it's a positive. Any property can be positively geared if you've got enough cash to sink into it to start off with. Which generally, if you're Australian, you don't, but if you're Chinese, you do have enough money to sink into it. All right, next one. So here's one of the cons. So there are some negatives of positive gearing, I should say. Number one is that you actually have less options. There's only something like 7% of all properties that are available for sale at the moment are positively geared. So you're actually kind of working with a fairly small segment of the market. Now, I know you guys bought a positively geared property and you did really well, but we had to...
Thank you,
that's right. We had to work pretty hard to find that one, didn't we? So you can do it, but they're a lot harder to find. So we'll move to the next slide. Now, there's also some risk associated with positively geared properties. Now, they may be in... Generally, I'll talk about this in a minute, but generally positively geared properties, they're a little bit unique and a little bit special. Otherwise, you know, and because they're unique and special, there may be some risk associated with them. Now, one of the things, if you go and buy a property in Karratha or Port Hedland or Newman, which have just about halved in value over the last however long, which I was smart enough to buy one of just before it all crashed. If you buy property, you can still buy positively geared property up in one of those places, and you've always been able to buy positively geared properties up in those places. But there's a risk because the market, it's a bit more boom bust up there and it's a little bit more volatile. It can be the same, so you've got to be careful with, you don't want to necessarily pick a dud or pick a dummy just because it's positively geared. You need to do your research, you need to make sure you know what's happening in the area, what's happening in the region. You know, is this likely that you're going to get good capital growth? Because at the end of the day, the capital growth, the underlying capital growth of the property is going to have a much bigger impact on you and your personal finances than whether it's positively or negatively geared. So don't get suckered into buying a negatively geared property that's not going to have the capital growth. Does that make sense? Let's go to the next slide. So, like we just said, positively geared property can be very hard to find. You might have to do a lot more research and kind of do a lot more searching and digging to find some positively geared property. Now, in this room, you've got a whole bunch of property professionals. You've got builders, you've got developers, you've got real estate agents and whatnot. Now, we actually are in this world and in this space a lot. So we actually come across a lot more properties. We come across maybe hundreds and thousands of properties every month that we're looking at and going through and doing appraisals on and whatnot. Now, because we're seeing so many more properties, we also come across positively geared properties. And we've got some examples later on. Peter's going to be talking, he's going to be sharing with you some options of some properties that are genuinely positively geared. So they can be hard to find, but if you know where to look, they're still out there. Let's go, next slide, Joe. So this is one of, Pete's going to talk to us a little bit more about this later. This is the photo on the right. It shows positively geared properties are often somewhat unique. I'm saying that's as a negative. It's not really a negative, but if you just go into a typical suburb and buy a typical average home, it's not going to be positively geared. Generally with positively geared property, there's going to be something unique about them. There's going to be something different about them, and that's what makes it positively geared. One of the example of the picture you've got there is dual key properties. I really like dual key properties. What dual key means is there's actually two different parts of the property that you can rent out. Because there's two different parts, the rent goes way up, which makes it positively geared because you're making a whole heap more money. But that's quite unique. That's not like a typical average home in a typical average suburb. It's something special. Right, let's go to the next one, Trev. Now, here's another possible negative of positively geared property. Now, your asset value can be tied to the rental value. Does that make sense? So, because if you have a positively geared property, and because it's often quite unique, often when you go to sell that property, the people that are interested to buy that property from you are other investors, because it's a unique property that was getting a high rent. Does that make sense? So if kind of mum and dad and two kids, they might not be interested to live in your property that was positively geared because there was something different about it. Now, because of that, because your end market is going to be other investors, the value of your home is often much more closely tied to the rental value of that home than it otherwise would be. And what that means is if rents drop, the value of your home might drop. That's what happened in Port Hedland and Karratha and Newman. You know, the rental values dropped first and then the values of the home dropped. That's what we see happening in other positively geared properties. There's a much tighter link between the rental value and the asset value of the home. So I'll move to the next one. So I'll say this is another negative. Now, if you want to buy a house in a premium suburb like Mullaloo or Ocean Reef or Uluru, it's going to be almost impossible for you to find a positively geared property. Why is that? Anyone want to throw out an idea as to why that would be? Big deposit. So
They're expensive homes.
they're expensive homes. And really what it has to do with is the underlying land value is worth a lot more. So you've got to pay a whole bunch more to get in there. So it just means it's not going to be positively geared. And what often happens in those, you go and buy a nice house in like, City Beach or Trig or what, you buy like a $2 million house in there. What are you going to rent a $2 million house for in there? Maybe $1,000 a week, maybe $800 a week. Whereas if you buy like a $340,000 house in Merriwa, you might be able to rent it out for $400 a week, something like that. So you actually get a lot better return in the more affordable areas. So in some of the more premium areas, it's almost impossible to find positively geared property. So if you're an investor and you're going to say, look, I just want to buy $1 million properties, it's going to be more difficult for you to find positively geared properties in those more premium areas, if that makes sense. Let's go next slide. Now here's another negative of positive gearing. You may be reliant on specific kinds of tenants. And what that means is, now a lot of the time around the universities, so Edith Cowan University, around Curtin University, around UWA, you find a lot of what happens is you have a 4x2 house and you'll be able to rent it out room by room. You'll be able to charge a fortune for all the uni students that want to live in those houses, and I've done this myself, and you can get really good rent return. Those properties end up being positively geared, which is great, but you're reliant on a specific kind of tenant. Another kind of tenant that you might be relying on to get positively geared property is like FIFO workers. A lot of the times, like, close to the airport and things, you can get like a higher rental return. Some of the times in these regional areas, you're kind of reliant on these specific kinds of tenants to get your higher rent. Now that can be good when there's lots of those tenants around, but if something happens in the economy or something changes or whatever, like the university closes down or gets smaller or whatever, that can be a factor that you need to consider. All right, let's go to the next slide, Trev. So, the big question, which is better? Who reckons, put your hand up for me, who reckons negatively geared property is better? Oh, no one.
Starting out or not.
Yeah, depends what you want to do, okay.
What age group? Depends what age group.
Oh, that's a very good point. So next question, who reckons positively geared property is better? Yeah, there's a few more hands up there. I think my honest answer to that is, it depends on your personal circumstances. And what you need to do is you need to go and get a bunch of people around you that you can bounce some of those questions off, like financial advisor, like accountant, like mortgage broker, like property coach, and you need to find out what's best for you. Now, if you're someone who's ancient and you're and you're let's say you're retired or you're just about to retire and you're going to buy an investment property, are you going to be able to afford in your retirement to hold a negatively geared property? Probably not, unless you've got tons of savings or something, probably not, but you've got to take into account your specific circumstance. If you're a very young person and you're still a student or you're hardly earning any money, can you afford to hold a negatively geared property? Probably not. If you're like a doctor and you're earning 400 grand a year doing this and that, can you afford to hold a negatively geared property? Yeah, you probably can. And maybe for those kind of people, you need to focus a little bit more that way. But what I want to say to everyone is, can I grab the clicker again? Thank you. Now, what I want to say is this. I want to encourage everyone. In this room, you've got some real industry experts. And what I was encouraged to do when I was a young fellow, when I was 17, I think probably 18, 19, 20 years old, I started coming to seminars like this. I started reading books like Rich Dad, Poor Dad and Richest Man in Babylon and all these kind of books that you read as a kid. And somewhere along the way, someone encouraged me to develop a 10-year property investment plan. And I didn't really know what to do with that, but I kind of sat down with some people and I kind of wrote it out and I set myself some goals and I wanted to buy like a certain number of properties and this and that. And what I decided to do was that the first property I bought was a property that I lived in because I needed somewhere to live because mum and dad didn't want me anymore, so I had to go and buy a property to live. The next property I bought was investment property, and what I chose to do, and it kind of fit in it because I knew I wanted to buy a couple of other properties, I wanted to build my investment portfolio, I decided the next property I bought would be a positively geared property because I knew some old guy that I knew, he sat down with me, he was kind of took me under his wing, he gave me this advice, he said, he goes, if you buy a negatively geared property, he goes, are you going to be able to afford it? And I went, yeah. And he goes, okay. He goes, and if you go and buy another negatively geared property and another negatively geared property and another negatively geared property, and I was only earning, I was 22, I was probably only earning 35 grand a year or something, like school teacher, whatever you earned back then, 40 grand a year maybe. And he said to me, you might be able to buy one, but you're not going to be able to afford to buy that many negatively geared property because eventually you're just going to run out of money. So he said, what you need to do is go out and buy, you need to focus on the rent return and that will enable you to build your portfolio. And I was just a young, dumb kid, but that was great advice for me. So the first two investment properties I ever bought were positively geared. They were positively geared the day I bought them. Every year on my tax return, they giving me money. The rent was great. The rent was always increased. And then what I was able to do was, after I'd had those two that were always giving me money all the time, then I was able to start being a bit more adventurous and go out and doing these other things like development and this and that and other things. And I bought some like a unit, like a holiday unit kind of thing, which was more for kind of family reasons or, you know, like holiday reasons rather than investment reasons. But you can start to do all these other kind of creative things that you want to do. So my advice to all of you guys is figure out what you want to do. Figure out if you want to be an investor. Figure out if you want to like invest in property. Figure out if you want to build your property portfolio. And if you decide, yeah, I'm keen on that. I want to like invest in my financial future. I believe in property. I think it's a good thing to do. I'd say come and talk to someone. We'll get around you. We'll encourage you. You can tick on we're going to do some feedback sheets in a minute. You can tick on our box and say, yeah, I want to have someone talk to me about developing a 5-year property investment plan, or sorry, I should say 10-year property investment plan. We'll do that. We'll help you and we'll make sure you get the right advice. And the last thing I want to say before I go is don't put off until tomorrow what you can do today. Because far too many people, and I did this myself, far too many people, you kind of put off and put off and put off and put off and you never end up doing anything. Does that mean you should rush out and buy something straight away? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. The first thing you need to do though is go and talk to Phil and say, hey Phil, can I afford to buy the next property? And he will say, yes you can, or no you can't. And if the answer is no you can't afford to buy it, and you need to wait, you know, let's say you need to wait 18 months before you're able to buy something, you spend the next 18 months educating yourself, learning about property, you know, investing in your brain power so that when you do buy something, you're going to make the right decision. And if Phil says, yes, you can buy something now, well then come and talk to us and we've got lots of great options as well. Thank you very much.